We are recording this session, and we can share the recording with people if they're interested afterwards. So yes, hi everyone. I'm Danielle, and I will be one of the speakers here today. This is what we had planned to deliver for you, and thank you so much for joining us today. So first, we'll start out by going over some information about the dashboard, how we develop it, what it's used for. And then Haley will take over and she will spend some time delivering some information about climate change. We did ask people to answer a few questions when you registered for this workshop, and we were pleased to see that about half of people are actually working on a climate change project right now. And so we're pretty confident that most people have at least a little bit of understanding about climate change, but Haley will talk a little bit about that as well. Then she'll talk about some systems thinking approaches for how to think about things holistically. Then we'll come back to me and I will talk a little bit about how to use the dashboard to develop some actions and strategies. And we know from our registration questions that about 20% of people who registered said that their capacity for data analysis is limited. And so we're hoping that this tool can help with that. And then finally, we're going to spend most of our time today doing an interactive exercise where you'll break out into groups and they'll be facilitated, and then we'll all come back at the end and have some discussion. Okay, so what is this dashboard? So this whole project was really just meant to improve access to information and evidence for rural decision making. So we wanted to make sure that people could understand what their community context and conditions currently are. So we were hoping to adopt a standardized approach that people could use across jurisdictions and then measure progress over time as well. So we have developed a dashboard that presents data and indicators for rural well-being. Now that the dashboard is launched, which we launched it a couple of months ago, back in September. Now that it's live and launched, we will be spending time mobilizing knowledge, meeting with people, holding events like this to make sure that people are able to understand and use the tool. And we have been very fortunate to work with a number of partners on this project, including the Ontario Trillium Foundation, the government ministries of agriculture, food, and agribusiness, and also rural affairs. We've also done some work with York University, and we have an MOU with the Rural Ontario Municipal Association, along with Eco Canada. And of course, Orca is helping us today. So how did we get here, and what is sort of the basis for our system? Well, we became aware that this new standard had been released by CSA Group in 2022. And this standard sets out a list of around 120 different indicators that communities can use to measure and assess their well-being. There's about 7 different categories of these indicators, and they recommend using readily available data as much as possible. So we had to then take that list of indicators and do an assessment. So we assessed indicators for relevance for well-being, but also for data availability. And what we found through that assessment was that there was a bit of an over-reliance on more of the traditional sort of socioeconomic indicators and data sources. And there were significant gaps for indicators in the environment, society, and institutional categories. But specifically, the climate change indicators that the standard recommends are all listed here. I'm not going to read them out, but there were significant gaps of where communities would be able to find information at the local level for these indicators. So since our process and assessment resulted in some gaps, we identified some other indicators that can be used to address those gaps. And we did all of that work in collaboration with our focus group of rural data champions. And so the champions have helped us make sure that not only is the dashboard user-friendly and helpful, but that we've chosen the right indicators and the right data sources. And so their help has been instrumental in making sure that this project is successful. Now that, like I said, now that the dashboard is live, we're working with our champions to develop use cases and also to raise awareness of this project. And when we first started out, we had around 6 champions, and now we've got over 20 representing all of the communities and organizations listed here. So in the end, this is the result of our indicator assessment. So we have, again, 6 categories of indicators. And within each category, the indicators are further grouped into theme to help tell a bit of a focused story about well-being. There are separate dashboard pages for each of the indicator categories. The page that we'll be most focused on today will be the environment category, because that is where the climate change indicators are currently featured and housed. And I should also mention that we do plan to sort of do a review and assessment of our set of indicators at least once a year. And we're going to be using input and feedback from people who are using this system to make changes and be responsive to needs and try to address gaps as much as we can. So this is just a list of all of the different indicators that are in the environment category. So in the climate change category, we've got these. We have temperature of the hottest day, temperature of the coldest day, the length of the winter season, days where humidex is greater than 35 degrees Celsius. We also have the length of the growing season and precipitation. And this is all supported by data that we received from the climatedata.ca website from the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. We're also showing a number of other indicators on the environment page that can help provide more insight and context into what is going on. But unfortunately, we were not able to find any local data sources for some of these environmental hazards that we would have wanted to include as well. So this is just a screenshot, and I will be getting to a live demonstration in just a minute, but just sort of orient people if they haven't looked at the dashboard yet or if they're not familiar with it. This is what the landing page of the environment dashboard looks like. So all of the landing pages on the dashboard looks the same. There's a map for spatial context, and then there's a chart beside it so that you can see how the communities compare to each other. You could also focus in on the region by using the filters, or look at a specific community as well. And here you can actually also change the indicator to look at different indicators on the map to sort of notice spatial trends. This is the climate change theme on the environment page. So here's where you will find the climate change indicators that I just listed for you. This is where you can look at how much the climate is expected to change for your community in sort of the near future, so the 2041 to 2070 time period, and then also by the end of the century, which is the 2041 to 2070 time period. And so we are also showing information here about the actual projection. So the indicators that we're showing are the change that's expected to see, but then we're also showing what that actually looks like in the community. So what is the current value? And then what is the future value? And so each of the dashboard pages also includes tables for comparison. One is a comparison for different community types that just is instructive and illustrative purposes only. But the other table shows information for communities, and it shows all of the indicators together. So it's important to note that the climate change data that we got are average values for each community. And so any sort of aggregation to a regional level or for multiple communities is really just for illustrative purposes. But when you're actually trying to do some decision making, you should be looking at the values for your community. And so before we get into the live demonstration part of this session, I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we have published a really short video user guide. You can find this guide in multiple places on our website. It's around 6 minutes long, and it has a voiceover narration of me explaining how to actually use the dashboard. So this is a great resource to help you get started if you have any questions. There are bookmarks and chapters in the video to help you skip to the part that you might be most interested in or more curious about. Okay, and now I will just pause the slide presentation and go right to a web demonstration. So you can find the Wellbeing website on our main page. You can get to it either here from the top navigation or from the side. And so it's important to note that there are these different navigation methods, because when you're looking at the dashboard pages, the left side navigation menu will disappear. So if you want to see the dashboard pages, you just have to click first on this dashboard page here. And here you will get that sort of systems map that also shows you where to find the indicators that you might be interested in. So again, like I mentioned, the climate change indicators are found on the environment page. So just click the page, and just a couple of technical notes before we move on is that these are embedded Tableau dashboards. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a lag when you click on them, but that's perfectly normal. Another technical note is that we optimized these for viewing on a desktop device using a large screen, ideally. So there are mobile versions. You can look at this on your phone, you can look at it on a tablet, but it won't be the same. And the look and function is different. So we do recommend using a computer as much as possible. And so, like I mentioned, this is just the landing page that shows you the indicators here on the map. So let's say, for example, you wanted to look at what does the change in growing season look like on the map. So now you can look at that, and it gives you a really good sense of, where there might be some spatial patterns, where the change will be more pronounced, and where the change maybe won't be as significant. And if you scroll down, that's where you can find the links that I mentioned, and then also these tables here at the bottom. And important to note that the default selection for communities is all communities in Ontario, but there are multiple ways that you can sort through and filter that list. So you can click on the column headings if you want to sort by descending order or ascending order, so you can see which communities are at the higher end of a data range and which communities are at the lower end. You can also sort alphabetically, or you can filter the list by choosing a different region or choosing a community. So we actually always recommend starting with a region. So to select a region, you just click on the region filter, you uncheck all, you make your selection, and then you click apply. And then once you do that, it will zoom the map in to that location. And you can still see all of the information for the communities that are within that region. And then this list is filtered as well. So now you're able to look at details for the community that you might be interested in, but you can also see what the values are for neighboring communities as well. If you would like to download an image, you can do so by clicking on this button at the bottom. You can click on PDF and then download again, and it will generate a really simple visual for you that you can use for a meeting or a briefing or anything like that. But if you did want more detailed information, you could also download the data. So if you download a PDF, this is what it would look like. It just gives you basically a copy of what's on your screen. But we do also allow the downloading of data files. So if you navigate to the download data page, you'll see that we have individual files for each of the different categories. So the climate change information would be in the environment data file. And here on each of the files, you'll see a list of all the different indicators that are in that data file, along with the different data sources. And an important note here is that the data files include all data for any non-Indigenous community in Ontario. So you will have to do a little bit of searching to find what you're looking for, but it is all right there for you. Okay, and that was a really quick demonstration of how to use the dashboard and where to look for information. But I think at this time, we'll go back to the slides and I will turn it over to Haley.
Thanks very much, Danielle, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So if you can go to the next slide. I just want to kind of get us all on the same page and start with some images. I'm sure everyone has experienced climate change in some form, recognizing that it affects us all differently. And some of these images are probably familiar, but some of them might be, like the cooling center, a little bit less familiar in the rural context. So I just want to kind of give us this context of, if you've seen it, it's more likely that it will continue to keep happening. Some of this being drought, flooding, human health impacts like hot days, needing air conditioning, people at risk because of their working conditions being outside. So some of these are just kind of a high level overview of some of the things that we'll be talking about. And if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so what do we mean when we're talking about climate? Weather and climate are often intertwined, but they're different. Weather is the analogy I like to use is, what are you wearing day to day? So I have a sweater on today because it's a little bit colder today, but in a couple of days it might be warmer, so maybe I'll wear a light cover up. Versus climate being, what do you have in your closet? What kinds of clothing do you have? So long term, is your closet full of warmer things, or is it full of things that are lighter for cooler, being more comfortable in hotter weather? So we're looking at things either day to day when talking about weather, or year over year when talking about climate. And next slide, please. And when we're talking about climate, there's kind of two sides of this story as well. We have mitigation, which many people are more familiar with. It's riding your bike to work to reduce emissions. It's using high efficiency light bulbs. It's green energy and renewable energy. And this impacts the reduction of climate change. So we're managing and mitigating the causes of climate change. Versus on the other side, what we're talking about today more so is adaptation. How do we protect ourselves from the inevitable? There is a change in climate, and we have to be able to withstand some of these impacts like floods and extreme weather. So how do we live well with these impacts? And that ties really nicely into well-being, of course. Can we go to the next slide? So what we're talking about is risk. What is the risk that we are looking at for the future? How far away is it? What's the likelihood and the impact of this going to be? The consequence. So this equation is really just, how much of a risk are you looking at in the future in your community? Next slide. And another equation is, what is the vulnerability of your community? So this is a combination of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So exposure being, there's heat waves, there's poor air quality, there's flooding predicted. But that doesn't impact everybody equally. So in your community, what is the population like? How healthy and how adaptive is your community? Do people have strong social ties? Does the infrastructure support things that protect people from extreme heat, like splash pads and tree canopy? Do individuals have air conditioning in their homes? So it's a combination of how bad is the impact going to be based on the exposure. So what is the event? And then what is the population? And then how are they socially and infrastructural connections? So next slide. And the rural context is different, of course. It's slightly different from town to town, from region to region, based on geography, of course, but there's also the unique commonalities that rural communities have. And that's often seen as the reliance on natural resources. Economies are built on a lot of the natural resources in these areas. Geographic remoteness, so lack of connectedness to some of the physical infrastructure and social infrastructure due to limited institutional capacity for things like healthcare and systems. So depending on where you're located, how close you are to some of these services and funds and systems, that community can be impacted differently. And next slide. And so this all connects well with the concept of systems thinking. So we're thinking about things not just as an environmental impact or an environmental indicator. We're thinking about the infrastructure that we're building, the people that live in our communities. Next slide, please. So this graphic is a handy one that just shows how nested and interconnected some of these different systems are. And we're looking at ecosystem today, but nested within that is society and economy and individuals. So climate change impacts will be cumulative and synergistic, meaning that it's not just going to happen once, it will happen multiple times, and the impacts will accumulate. They will also impact individuals, economy, society, and ecological systems, not just one at a time. They will be interconnected. Change in one area can adversely affect in another area. So if ecosystem is part of your economy, then that is going to show up when these climate events happen. And of course, social connectivity and social infrastructure can be impacted greatly. So the majority of services and stakeholders will be directly or indirectly impacted by climate change. And that is based again on their proximity to these events or their adaptive capacity. How well can they recover? And how well can your community recover? So often we're looking at creating plans that build our adaptive capacity. And that's an area that municipal government can really lead in. Next slide, please. So connecting this back to the platform, these are the different indicators that are represented in the environment tab. So we have climate change, which of course is on that adaptation side, and the other indicator tabs are leaning a little bit more to the mitigation side. So there's commuting, ecological footprint, but conservation sits nicely in between the two because, for example, conserving and preserving some of these ecosystems and natural spaces like forests and meadows really builds our adaptive capacity by creating heat sinks, for example, as well as absorbing emissions and greenhouse gas. So next slide. And across the entire platform, there are all of these other tabs. We've seen health, demographics, economics, housing, and society. So all of these things are connected within this systems lens. And what we're looking at today, of course, is that climate change environment layer. And all of it is interconnected, and some of it can be brought to life by understanding more about the health or the demographics and economics of your community. So it's really about that interconnected lens and combining some of these indicators to bring them to life to really get meaning out of them. And that brings me to Danielle, who will talk about action.
Thanks very much, Haley. So that was a really great overview of what we could sort of expect and what some of the challenges might be. So the question is, what can you do and how can you use our dashboard to help you? And we're hoping that sort of no matter where you're at in your climate change planning, whether it's for adaptation or mitigation, I know, and again, today we're focused on adaptation, but wherever you are in that process, we are hopeful that the dashboard can help you. So you can gather helpful information at any of these stages. So whether you're in early stages of planning, you can use the dashboard to explore what's currently going on. So look at the historical values for the climate change indicators, for example, and that will help you establish a baseline. You can also identify questions or issues that might come up when you're looking at that information, and it helps contextualize what's happening in your community. So you can also look at, like Haley said, the other indicators as well to understand the sort of profile of people who are living in your community, understand the risks and vulnerabilities that they might be facing. You can also use the dashboard to assess risk. And that's something we're going to talk about in a little bit once we get to our interactive exercise. But you could also use it, for example, to create a business case, or if you're applying for funding, you could use this information to form the basis of some of those kinds of applications or those kinds of processes as well. And then moving forward, if you are taking action, you can use some of the indicators to help establish goals and targets. And then over time, using this dashboard, we hope that you'll be able to measure progress and see what's working well, what might need some adjustment. And then if things are going really great, then you can celebrate success. And another thing is that you can share those stories, and it's important to know when things are going well. And maybe, similar communities can take advantage of some of those things that have worked really well. So how can we use climate data in a rural context? So what we're suggesting and proposing that people do is take a look at the climate change indicators and look at the changes that are expected to understand what might be happening locally, and then brainstorm actions that you could do to sort of minimize those impacts and improve resilience. So for example, if your community might be facing an increase in the temperature of the hottest day, then some of the actions that you might brainstorm might be to, plant more shade trees to maybe reduce the energy costs associated with cooling. You might want to create a fire smart plan if your community might be at risk of wildfires. Another thing you could do is prepare emergency cooling stations, or you could develop water retention infrastructure if your community might be prone to drought, or if you're expecting more drought conditions in the future. So there's a whole range of things, and really these actions will really depend on your community, where your community is located, and who's living in your community. You can take this further too to develop broader strategies as well. So you could develop maybe like an infrastructure plan. I know there's lots of work that's being done to develop climate ready infrastructures. So, if you are expecting more precipitation, for example, on sort of data and information side, then a strategy might be looking at how to flood proof communities. So how to look at ways of reducing, storm water runoff, or how to better manage those extreme events when they happen. If your community, for example, has a history of certain extreme weather, you can expect maybe that will increase the frequency and severity of those events may increase. So you might want to look at developing some infrastructure plans on making sure that people can get around if they need to evacuate, or making sure that people know where to go and where there are safe spaces for them. And in a lot of communities, where, like Haley mentioned, where their economies are, really resource dependent, or where there's a lot of traditional activities like hunting and fishing, some of those activities or actions may be affected by climate change. And so it's important to know what those changes will be so that people can adapt. But really, your community best. Like Haley mentioned, it will look different. Climate change will look different in every community, and your experiences are really informative, or they should be informative. And so it's important to use those to think about, what kinds of things have you noticed happening, and what kinds of things do you think will happen more frequently in the future, and how were you affected in the past by those things, and what maybe you've come up with some ideas of what could make those events more manageable, what could improve resilience, what could improve your ability to recover quickly from those kinds of events. And so, it's important to have conversations, talk to people in your community. And this is one of the things that I think, rural communities have in terms of a strength. So there's in many communities, there's a lot of strong social capital and social networks in rural communities. People are really close. They know a lot of people in the community. And so you can really leverage that strength. There's also a lot of place-based knowledge systems that rural communities can tap into when they're trying to understand what might be different and what's changing, and also higher rates of community participation and involvement. Okay, so we are moving quickly here, and I think we're already at our interactive exercise portion. So that's great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of introduce the exercise, and then we will break out into groups. So each of the breakout groups will use the Wellbeing Dashboard to gather data for sort of a planning exercise. But the facilitators will help people in each of the groups to look for indicator data for a specific community on the dashboard. The facilitators will input that data, and also any brainstorming activities will be recorded into worksheets that we have already prepared. Once we've done that, after about half an hour, we'll do a report back so that each group can share their findings. And we will share the completed worksheet with all participants after the workshop. And you will also get a copy of the slides as well. So I'm going to show you what the worksheet looks like and just take you through sort of an example. So I have already gone through this exercise, and I just want to show you what it would look like. Here we go. Okay, so when we were trying to think about how to help people use this dashboard, what struck us was, what do people need to know and how could they use that information? So the first thing to do, or the first thing that I did in trying to come up with this exercise was I went to the climate change dashboard and looked at the indicators. And I noted the historical value for these 4 different indicators. So I noted, what is the current length of the growing season? What is the current length of the winter season? How many humidex days is a community experiencing right now? And how much total precipitation in rain and snow is a community receiving? And so I went to the dashboard and I found those numbers. And so I'll just show you how I did that. So I went to the environment page and I was focusing specifically on Huron County for reasons I will explain later. So to choose a region again, you just unclick all, you click what you want and then you click apply. And I wanted to know the growing season. And sometimes it's helpful also to look at things spatially on the map to see, even for this region, this change looks different for different communities that are within this region. So some communities will see shorter increase in the growing season length, and some communities will see a longer increase or a greater increase. So going to the climate change indicator tab now, I was interested in specifically looking at the data for Goderich. So also something to note is that when you are using the filters, they are only showing you relevant values. So now that I've chosen the region of Huron County, the only communities that are here in this filter are the communities that are part of this region. So again, I wanted to look at Goderich, so I unclicked all, and then I clicked on Goderich. And here we go. So I looked at these pieces of information to populate those spreadsheet numbers. So if we're looking, for example, this first one is the length of the growing season. So for Goderich, so in this community, the growing season length, according to the historical average from 1971 to 2000, the average growing season length is 174 days. So I took that number and I put it in here in this spreadsheet. And then I wanted to know what would that look like in the future. So in the future, that looks like a growing season of 208 days. And then I inputted that here, and then I calculated just the percent change to sort of give some context for how much or how significant that change might be. And so I did that for the other indicators as well. So for the winter season and for humidex days. So I just changed this value here. And you can see here, so 61 days is the current length of the winter season, but that will decrease to 34 days in the future. So I put those numbers in here. And then I did that for the other climate change variables as well. And that's just the climate change piece. So then the other side of it, like Haley was talking about, is thinking about the people in your community. And so I've actually come up, I developed a list of some of the other types of indicators that might be helpful in trying to understand what's currently going on in your community. And so there are indicators from across all of the different categories and themes that are also in the dashboard that can help you understand what's currently going on. So for me, I looked at, the population of the community, the population density, how old people were, so the median age, and then also the median household income. And then I know this text is probably too small for you to read, but then I did a bit of an assessment to look at some other indicators as well. So looked at, the top 3 employment industries, for example, to see, what economically, what might be some of the impacts of these changes. I also looked at the proportion of people who are in 1-person and 1-parent households, because people there might be feeling lacks of social support or some financial hardship as well. You can also look at some housing indicators. And so I was curious to know how many people were in unaffordable housing, or how many people had access to high-speed internet. And so I looked at all of those different types of indicators together to come up with an assessment of the people that live in this community. And then I took all of that information together. So the climate change data with the community profile information. And I sort of brainstormed what some potential impacts might be and who might be more at risk of those impacts. And that's what I put here in this assess impact column. So for example, the number of humidex days in this community is increasing from 8 to 35. So that's a 327% increase in the number of extreme heat days. So that could mean an increase in energy use for cooling buildings, but it could also mean that people who don't have air conditioning would be at risk from heat-related illnesses, which also is important because mining is one of the top industries in this community. So people who are working outdoors, they might also be at greater risk of extreme heat days. And so then once I had identified some of those impacts, I looked at actions. So what could the community do to sort of manage or minimize those impacts? So for example, if we're talking about extreme heat days, they could look at making sure that there's infrastructure to have cooling stations open. Maybe would look at planting some shade trees in residential areas to reduce that heat and that need. So that's sort of a really quick overview of what this exercise will look like. So each group will tackle one of the climate change indicators that we had listed here on that page. So with your group, you'll go through the dashboard, you'll find the information, you'll do some brainstorming discussions, and then we'll all come back together and all of that information will be populated into this combined spreadsheet. And then we'll have time for a broader conversation and discussion. So I think at this time, Mel, we're ready for the breakout groups.
Sounds good. So I'm just going to reclaim host. And I think I will pause recording because we can't record in the breakout groups.
Hey everyone, welcome back as we trickle back in. Mel, can you restore my screen sharing ability?
Absolutely. Let me get that back for you. Participants, here we go. Danielle. Make host.
Thanks, Mel. Okay, you can see the screen again. Okay, so people are trickling back. Do we have most people back already? I think so. Okay, so we're just going to do a quick report back from each of the groups. Stacey, how about your group goes first?
Sure. I didn't realize you were finishing. We had to quickly do that last part. Something should be there in the action category, but it hasn't populated yet. I'm not sure why. Oh, there it is. Okay, So we saw that the historical growing season was 170 days, with the future being 200. That's an 18% change, around 30 extra days, a whole extra month. And so we each went and looked for a different indicator. And we had a group that was already pretty familiar with the dashboards, which was great. And so you can see all the ones here. We thought agriculture might be a top industry, but it wasn't. We did have someone that took a bit of a closer look. It saw that there are still 390 jobs in that sector, but there's been a decline significantly, and we discussed, maybe that might be due to automation. We also looked at some different, maybe vulnerable populations, and immigrants. Were thinking about workers coming to work in the agriculture sector. In the assessing impacts, we focused on the economic lens, which could be both positive and negative. So some benefits could be like for farmers for purchasing local food, but also some hardships. Sorry for the typo. Farmers are aging out, land is expensive to purchase, loss of jobs from automation and requiring potentially more inputs to deal with pests and invasive species. The one action we very quickly in the last couple of minutes brainstormed some actions, and we thought about some incentives for careers in agriculture. Oh, I can't hear you, Danielle.
Sorry, no worries. I just noticed that for some reason this was duplicated from your section to mine. I'm not sure why that happened. Anyway, but yeah, thanks very much, Stacey. That was really interesting, and it sounds like your group was really engaged. It's nice to know that they were already familiar with using the dashboard, so that's great. My group did winter season. So we found that the current length of the winter season in South Huron is 64 days, and that is going to decrease to 37 days in the future. So that's a decline of around 42%, or again, around 30-ish days. We looked at a number of demographic and economic indicators to try to understand some of the risks and vulnerabilities, and we singled out children as being vulnerable groups for this, in that they may experience increased instances of illnesses or sicknesses from insects like Lyme disease, or insects like ticks who carry Lyme disease, and other types of illnesses as well. And so what we talked about in terms of actions were actually developing a strategy that includes more focus on surveillance for insects or invasive species. And the strategy also includes education and awareness so that people are aware of those risks and can prepare themselves accordingly. Okay, next we had Humidex days. I think, was that you, Mel? I think that was you.
Yeah, that was me. Let me get back to that spreadsheet. Well, you guys really made some progress. We really dug into navigating the dashboard and orienting ourselves to the indicators. So we found that with Humidex days, historically, there are currently 11 Humidex days, and in the future there will be 39. So that represented a pretty significant increase of 255%. So knowing that, we began to look at some of the other indicators that would be important to help us understand how our community members could be impacted by that change. And so we brainstormed several, and we narrowed it down to population and the percentage of seniors and income. So what we discovered is that in South Huron, 29% of the population is over the age of 65, which is actually higher than the provincial average. as far as income, we discovered that 10% of the households in South Huron are low-income households, and 38% of senior households make up low-income households. So, of course, we were considering the impacts of heat on an older adult population. We just didn't get quite that far to get that captured. So if there's a higher proportion of seniors in South Huron, then naturally that might be a priority population, particularly because many seniors live in low-income households, so they may not have access to cooling solutions to deal with the increase in hot days. So I can quickly capture some of that now, but that's the gist of what we discovered through the exercise.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mel. Okay, and Haley, over to you for precipitation.
Yeah, thanks. So we initially started looking at the industries that people are working at, and of course the increase of precipitation and how that would affect people. So there's a 9% increase of precipitation from historical to future. And we were discussing a lot of things to do with how is flooding going to impact people. We didn't quite get to it, but as we were talking just now, I looked at renters as the population. So we ended up speaking about actions for rental homes, looking at a basement flooding support program for landlords and renters, and how to communicate to them, do you have the right insurance for your home, inform people of the cost. There is some discussion, I believe, Susan, you had worked on this before. You were saying that $1 that is reimbursed by the insurance company is $3 spent by the homeowner. So looking at flooding and the population and those risks, we determined that it would be helpful for this community to have some supports targeted to rental units for basement flooding.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone, for participating in that session. Hopefully you found it helpful. We do have a few more minutes for report back or for further discussion following that report back. But before we go further, I think we'd like to launch another poll question just to ask sort of like, you know, how has this session helped you? Has it made you more comfortable? If not, you know, happy to have more sessions. So, you know, like I said, we are really focused on mobilizing knowledge and mobilizing the use of this dashboard. So we're happy to hold one-on-one events or one-on-one meetings or demonstrations to help people understand how to use this. We're also developing use cases. And so I'm really pleased to say that we're actually going to be working with Huron County, specifically with Derry and her group, to develop a risk and vulnerability assessment for the communities in Huron County. So we're happy to, you know, help other people through that process as well. And once that use case is completed, we will hopefully be sharing it with everybody to see how it went and how helpful the dashboard was in doing that analysis and doing that work. But maybe we can just take a few minutes to open it up. If anyone has any burning questions they'd like to ask, please feel free to unmute and go ahead. We have some questions here, just, you know, to sort of prompt people. If you're working on something similar, it'd be great for us to hear that. Do you think this exercise could be helpful? But anything you'd like to talk about would be great.
I don't have a question so much as a comment. Thank you for doing this exercise. I often don't do this. My researchers do it for me. And I like how the exercise was laid out to look at different things and come narrow down to a specific action. I think sometimes when looking at data, there's so much data, where do you start? So just comment, this was really good.
Thanks very much, Dana. Susan.
Yeah, I'm just really intrigued where the more specific climate data may have come from. Is that from the Canada Climate Atlas?
It's from the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, and so they have a website called climatedata.ca. We didn't get it directly from the website. We worked with staff and they gave us a data set. So, but individual communities, you can access some of that information. And there's a lot more indicators. They have, you know, a huge long list of climate change indicators for which you can find data on their website. We only focused on a couple of them.
And so in using data from your site, is there a way to find the source? Because that's always helpful to declare the source, right?
Yes, so all of our data sources are listed in a few different places. So if you go to the download data page, we have a whole list here of all of our different data sources, and there are links back to each source. But if you wanted to know specifically for each indicator, if you click on the definitions page, you can download a PDF document that has detailed definitions and also lists for that indicator's specific data source. So all of that information is available from the website as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Noel, I think I saw you raised your hand.
Yeah, so the answer to your question, would you like to see a risk and vulnerability matrix, is yes. I think that would be helpful. I'm glad you mentioned the source where you got some of your data, because one of the things that's important to municipalities is to know more about the potential for freezing rain, because that is more expensive for the roads crews to deal with than actually a big snowfall. And it's also harder on our roads. We have a lot of gravel roads, so it contributes to more deterioration because of freeze and thaw. So when we were back in the climate indicators, I understand why, you know, people would want to know how long winter lasts. Is it getting shorter? But also within that, there's what's happening within winter. You know, are we having a lot of freeze and thaws? So that's an indicator that I'll see if they have at climatedata.ca. But I just thought I would mention to you, you know, for municipalities, that would be an important one to know, just beyond sort of the length of winter or the length of the growing season.
That's great, thank you. And like I said, we are planning on being very responsive to the needs of people who are using this system. So if there are other indicators that would be helpful, we are very happy to hear that feedback from people. So if you have even not just that one, but if there are other indicators that you're curious or interested in seeing, please, you know, send those suggestions to us, and we will do our best to be responsive to that.
Yeah, I think just in general, I really like maps. So when we were talking about the indicators like the number of health facilities available or the number of long-term care facilities in the area, something that we talk about in our local emergency preparedness exercises is, so say we open some warming centers, you know, do we want people driving on really bad roads to get to those warming centers? So, and we only have sort of one really in the township, and it's at the very far west end of the township. So we're not going to expect, you know, everybody in the township to drive to that west end. So I just think it would be interesting, you know, to see sort of a regional map, because it struck us that, well, they may not need to drive to the very west end of Tay Valley because they could just hoof it into Perth on that side of the township. So, you know, when we're identifying risks, like, okay, there's going to be more hot, humid days. And if we want to open warming centers, do we need to partner with either other municipalities or maybe groups in our township? Like, say, a church has a really great air conditioning system because they just bought a heat pump or something. You know, it's kind of having that, whatever, not quite 10,000 foot view, but just a over perspective of, you know, where are the resources that we can use to send people to in these situations. That's just a thought.
If I could answer part of that, one of the features that's built into the dashboard that wasn't part of the demonstration today, is to look simultaneously at multiple communities. So, Noel, you know, I'm in Perth, and we have need often to have a collective view of Perth, Tay Valley, and Drummond North Elmsley. You can do that on the dashboard. You select the 3 communities, you can see it on the map, what geography you're
nice.
looking at, and you can see the data on the same screen at the same time of multiple communities. And you can even cross community boundaries. So Smith Falls looks at Rideau Lakes, 2 different counties, but you can put those 2 communities on the map at the same time, see the data together. Then you get an idea of, you know, what is our functional community and how are we collectively situated in relation to a certain kind of issues. So, you know, Danielle's got Lanark County on the screen, so you can select, you know, any number of those communities or a community from an adjacent county and
Great.
have a map of your functional community.
Yeah, and you can choose multiple regions as well. So here, like I've only chosen Lanark County, but you can choose the neighboring counties as well if you wanted to do that investigation, like you just mentioned, about seeing what is available for the neighboring communities. You could easily do that as well.
Thank you.
I think I've seen another hand up. Was it Susan again, I think? No? Okay, well, great. Is there any other questions, comments, thoughts? Haley, anything you'd like to close out with before we end it?
I guess maybe just an offer if anyone needs any support. The Orca support desk link is in the chat, so feel free to reach out there as well, and we can help talk through some of this stuff too. But yeah, as Danielle has on the screen, I think both of us can become resources.
Yeah, thanks. And that's a good point is, you know, Orca is an organization that I wasn't aware of until we formed this partnership with them, but they do offer a lot of really helpful resources for communities, really just helpful communications information, you know, how to talk about climate change, what is climate change, all of that really basic stuff, onto more advanced stuff about, you know, how to plan, how to do planning, how to develop infrastructure. So they're a really great resource, and I do encourage you to check it out. And like I said, we are really trying to focus on knowledge mobilization. So if you would like to have any kind of one-on-one session with us, or if you'd like to schedule a session with us and your team, we're happy to do that. Go ahead, Susan.
Sorry, yes, thank you. So I know you've recorded this, and will we be getting a recording, and can we share it with other people?
Absolutely, yeah, we will share the recording, and we'll also share the slides and that worksheet, like I said. So if, you know, after that you have any questions, please do get in touch with us. Okay. Well, I think we are like 6 minutes over time, so I really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for your interest. I hope to hear from you soon or work with you in the future. Thanks very much and have a great day.